Lecture 18, Lays of Ancient Rome.
We are discussing the legends, the heroes, the history of the early days of Rome. The stories that in the 1st century BC, the Romans looked back upon, as we today look back upon the foundation of our own country. And the Romans of the time of Caesar Augustus, having squandered their freedom, look back to the time when they were heroes who had the values and virtues of patriotism, of courage, of believing that the most noble thing you can do is to die for your country. Even as many of us look back and wonder and awe at a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or the ordinary soldier in the Virginia militia who fought the greatest empire of the world and won in the name of freedom. We saw how Rome was founded by Romulus. And already by the time of Livy in the 1st century BC, he himself explained it was very difficult to separate the real history from the various fables that had grown up around Romulus. But after 150 years of archaeological research, excavating the Palatine Hill where Romulus founded Rome, seeing the evidence from the Roman Forum of a large palace from the time of Romulus, it simply baffles me that there are still scholars who say Romulus was a fiction and we can know nothing about the early history of Rome. That's just nonsense. There's a very strong kernel of truth to the story of the foundation of Rome, and there's an even stronger kernel of truth to the story of the foundation of the Roman Republic. What our founders saw as so intriguing in Livy is that Rome first had to be nurtured. The Roman people had to be nurtured by kings, even as we in our early history had to be nurtured by a monarchy. And Romulus was the first king, then came 6 kings following Romulus. And the second was good, the third was pretty good, the fourth was pretty good, but then power began to corrupt. And by the year 509 BC, the 7th king, King Tarquin, ruled over the Romans not as a monarch, not as a just king, but as a tyrant. And in fact, that was his nickname, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquin the Tyrant. And like a tyrant, he seized whatever he wanted to from the Roman people. He put heavy taxes upon them and demanded that they undertake works of public construction, such as digging a channel to drain the forum so it would be less marshy. And we have found all the evidence we need of that channel that was dug in the very end of the 6th century BC. So Tarquin was a real figure. And the Romans groaned under this tyranny, even as our founders believed they were groaning under the tyranny of George III. And it all came to a head with the typical act of a tyrant, the outrage of a free and noble woman. Tarquin also waged many wars, and in 509 BC, he was waging a war against the city of Ardea. We could go to Ardea today. It's a city of the Rutilians, a people related to but distinct from the Latins. We can walk around some of the walls that were there in the day of Tarquin. And the siege was going on, and all the Roman noble youth were out there, including Lucius Junius Brutus, his friend Collatinus, and there was also the son of Tarquin. And the siege was long and drawn out and got to be boring. And so these noble Romans began to debate among themselves, who is the husband of the most chaste woman? Whose wife is most chaste? Well, they argued back and forth and couldn't come to an agreement until finally they said there's only one way to settle this. There's no action going on here. Let's ride back to Rome. It's not a very long ride. Ride back to Rome, go to each of our houses and see whose wife is doing what. Well, they went to the house of Tarquin's wife, Tarquin the son's wife, and she was having this great big party. But then they went to the house of Collatinus, opened the door, and there was his wife, the beautiful Lucretia, spinning a cloak for him. Her maidservants there helping her weave the wool into a warm coat for her dear husband off on campaign. Well, there you have it, boys. And we have to admit your wife is the most chaste. They rode back, but the son of Tarquin could not get this out of his mind. That woman was so chaste, he just had to have her. Thus, while everyone else was asleep, he rode back again to Rome, rapped on the door of the house of Collatinus. Lucretia came to the door. Oh, has my husband been killed? No, but I bring you a message from him. Could I come inside, please? Oh, of course. I want to go to bed with you. Never. I want to go to bed with you. No. Well, I tell you what then, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill a slave. I'm going to put you in bed together. Then I'm going to spread the rumor that I found the two of you, the slave and you, in bed, and killed you. No, that would be too shameful for my husband. So, all right, let's go to bed. And they did. But after Tarquin had left, Lucretia sent off a message to her husband and said, you must return immediately. There is a terrible thing that has happened. He and his friend Lucius Junius Brutus rode back together, came into the house. There was the father of Lucretia. What has happened, my daughter? What has happened, my wife? I must tell you that I have shamed you. There is the imprint of another man in my bed. Who is it? It's Tarquin's son. He came here and forced me. And now I must die. You must not die. It's not your fault. No, it's not my fault. But at some other time, some less chaste Roman woman might use me as an example. So she pulled out from her dress a dagger and stabbed herself to death. And as she was falling, Lucius Junius Brutus picked up her body and went out into the street. And as the Romans began to gather round, Brutus said, Look what happens when you allow a tyrant to rule over you. Look what has happened to this chaste woman. We must take an oath right now, swear it, that we will drive the king out of Rome. We will drive his entire family out of Rome. And we will make the word king the most hateful word in our language. The Romans will never again have a king. Swear it, swear it. Even as we swore in our Constitution, we would never have a king. Every state would be guaranteed a republican government. Thus was Tarquin and his evil son and the whole family driven out. But Tarquin wasn't going to give up any more than King George was going to give up after the Declaration of Independence. Instead, just like King George, as a matter of fact, Tarquin not only found more troops, he got foreign troops to come and help him. Above all, the Etruscan king Lars Porsena of the city of Clusium, one of the most important and powerful of the Etruscan cities. The Etruscans were a people distinct in language from the Romans, but very closely related to them in culture, and from whom the Romans learned a good deal about Greece, and the Etruscans played a major role in transmitting Greek culture to Rome. But Lars Porsena was now their enemy because Tarquin had come to him, and Lars Porsena himself said, well, if they can overthrow a king in Rome, that's going to give all these people ideas that they can govern themselves under a republic. Thus he put together a large army, many of them mercenaries, and they marched upon Rome. All of this in this heroic year of 509 BC. Of course, scholars who are skeptical of this will say that too much is being pushed into one year. Well, that year of 1776, not only did we sign the Declaration of Independence, but Washington beat the British at Trenton. So a lot can be done in a year if you have leaders who are devoted to freedom. So Porsena came with his army, and the Tiber River that flows through Rome was the border between Roman territory and the territory of the Etruscans. So Lars Porsena took up his camp on the far side, the Etruscan side of the Tiber River, built a wall around it, temporary wall, and the Etruscans began their siege of Rome, and the Romans fought back. The Etruscans had more soldiers, and the Romans were not as trained for war as they would later become. They had become too soft under this king. And thus, in the first part of the battle, the Romans were driven all the way back, all the way across the river. And there was one bridge, a wooden bridge, over the Tiber River. And when the Romans had been driven back, the Etruscans were going to cross that bridge. And then 3 brave Romans stood forth. One of them, Horatius. Horatius the one-eyed, who had lost an eye in an earlier battle. And Horatius and his 2 comrades stood together on the Etruscan side of the bridge, and they dared all of the Etruscans to attack them. And at first, the Etruscans themselves could not believe such bravery. How could there be men like this? But they rushed them, and Horatius and his 2 friends fought them back again and again, their shields being filled with spears thrown at them. Then, as it became clear that the Etruscans were going to overwhelm them, Horatius turned to his 2 friends and said, "Boys, run across the bridge, and then chop it behind me. Run across the bridge and chop it down behind me. How will you get across?" Let me worry about that." And thus he alone held off a whole army while the bridge was chopped down. Then turned, still not throwing away his shield or sword, that because no Roman would throw away his shield or his sword. Brave Horatius leapt into the Tiber River, swam across, and emerged on the far side to the shouts and tributes of his army and to the shouts and tributes of the foe who honored such a brave warrior. But there were many as brave as Horatius in the Roman army. And when it became clear that the Romans could not defeat the Etruscans in battle, 100 Roman young men swore an oath that one by one they would swim across the Tiber River, go into the camp of Lars Porsena, and stab him to death, assassinate him. The first to draw the lot to swim across was Mucius, Gaius Mucius. Gaius Mucius swam across, made his way into the camp of the Etruscan king in disguise, and suddenly realized, come to think of it, I don't know what Lars Porsena actually looks like. There's a man, fancy dress, paying out money to the troops. That must be Lars Porsena. So Gaius Mucius ran up and stabbed to death Porsena's treasurer. There he was. He'd stabbed this man to death. Suddenly he was taken captive, and Porsena came out of his tent and said, "What are you doing? Why have you killed my treasurer?" "I am a Roman. That is all you need to know." "Oh, we have ways of finding out what you're up to. We're going to burn you with fire until you talk." "Fire? Where's the fire?" "Right there." And so Mucius took his right hand and put it into the flames and burned it off. There, he said to Porcena, do you think I'm afraid of torture? No, you're not, as a matter of fact. Go back to the Roman lines. I can only honor a man like you. Are there more? There was that Horatius, now there's you. Well, I'll tell you what. Since you have honored me, I will honor you. There are 99 more Romans just like me there. Each of us is going to come after you until one of us kills you. I can never defeat a people like this. I will leave. And so Lars Porsena took his mighty army and rode away, and Rome was free. Free. The same way that after Yorktown, the mighty fleet and mighty army of the British just sailed away, and we were free. But freedom always comes at a price. And you'll recall that after the victory had been won at Yorktown, the soldiers had still not been paid. And there was a movement among Washington's troops to get him to declare himself a king or a dictator. And he went out before them, fumbling with his glasses. I have grown gray in my country's service, he said, and now it seems I have grown blind. I cannot read you the speech I have written, but this I say, nothing has so wounded me in all my life than the very idea I would become a king. Go away. I will get you the money somehow. And he did. But so too in the early Roman Republic. In this same year of 509 BC, the sons of Lucius Junius Brutus undertook a plot to bring King Tarquin back. The first step in the new republic was to establish the two consuls that would be part of the Roman constitution all the way down until even the empire fell. Two men freely elected by the Roman people to be their commanders-in-chief, to serve for 1 year and to lead the Roman army wherever they chose. When the founders of our country were shaping our Constitution, it was to the Roman Constitution they turned. After all, how many functioning democracies, republics were there in 1787? Really none. Thus, the founders looked back to what they believed to be the model of a good Republican Constitution. And when they pondered what sort of executive they should have, they chose to have a president who would be commander-in-chief. So the consuls were commander-in-chiefs. And one of these elected was Lucius Junius Brutus, and the other elected alongside him was Collatinus. But word came that there was this plot afoot to bring back Tarquin. A number of the noble, the patrician Romans were involved in this because they found that once you had a republic, you had a government of law. And law is firm and harsh. So what were they going to do? They liked the idea of having a king again because, you could become the king's friend. You could get away with almost anything. So they were plotting to bring Tarquin back. It was discovered. And the guilty parties were brought before Lucius Junius Brutus. And he was appalled to see that among the key conspirators were his own sons. And with his own hand, he executed every one of them, leaving only one young child of his, one of his young sons, who had had no part in this. That was emblematic of the civic virtue of the Romans, their patriotism, their willingness to put the good of their country above their own individual interest, even above their own children. And so Lucius Junius Brutus became the model of the Roman the Roman of nobility, of courage, of patriotism. Now, these stories of early Rome were told over and over again down through the generations to young Romans. In the 2nd century BC, Polybius wrote a history of the rise of the Roman Empire. He lived until at least after 146 BC. His pupil was Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, who destroyed Carthage. Polybius himself had been brought as a hostage to Rome, taken into the house of the Scipios, one of these great patrician families, and grown to be very close to young Scipio, and wrote a history of the rise of Rome in Greek to show his fellow Greeks why in the course of one generation, from 202 BC to 167 BC, Rome had become master of the world. And the far less cultivated, the far less technologically advanced Romans had been able to destroy the power of the Greeks. And he gave one simple reason for it. It was the Roman constitution, a balanced constitution in which the people were the ultimate authority, in which there were 2 consuls, but their power was balanced by a wise Senate of 300, which formulated foreign policy. A separation of power between the judicial, the legislative, the executive branches. And that is what struck our founders. They read Polybius, and Polybius is more cited in the ratification debates than any other ancient figure, any other ancient authority. But Polybius said, and this is what also moved our founders, the best of constitutions will fail if the citizens are not patriotic. And the Romans do everything they can to raise their children to be patriots. And a key feature of this is that whenever there is a death of a prominent Roman, he is given a funeral procession, the mask of his ancestors, the bust of his ancestors are carried before him, and then the whole of the Roman people, specifically with their children, come into the forum, and they hear these old stories. And Polybius specifically mentions Horatius as being one of the most often told stories. And it's not only that, but they go back home, and at night, during the winter when it's cold, they sit around the fire. Or perhaps in the summer when they can sit out under the arbor. The father takes it as his duty to tell these stories to inspire patriotism in his children. I worry a very great deal, I must tell you, that we teach such an unpatriotic view of our country's history. In fact, I don't know of another nation that teaches such an unpatriotic view of our country's history. And historians are so avid in their desire to debunk our early history, to tear apart the stories about Washington or the Declaration of Independence. A Roman or Polybius would have told you that is most destructive. And over the long run, no democratic constitution can survive without patriotism and without the sense that when you go out to war, just like Horatius at the bridge, you are fighting for your country, for its freedom, and for its family. It is particularly interesting to me that the dissection of these stories of Rome's founding began after the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a revolution founded in a belief in the ideals of freedom that had come down from Rome. And it proved to be very destructive. And after Napoleon had been conquered, particularly in the Prussian universities like the University of Berlin. A generation of scholars rose that did its best to discredit all of these early stories. Whether Romulus was a fictional character, Horatius was a fictional character, there had never been such a thing as a real overturning of the government at Rome. It had been a very gradual process. Well, fortunately, one of the most favored and greatest authors of the 19th century in England, Thomas Babington Macaulay, thought differently. He read in Polybius about how these tales were told generation after generation, and he wrote in 1842 a magnificent set of poems called The Lays of Ancient Rome, in which he tried to recreate these stories as they might have been told around the hearth in an ordinary Roman's home, an ordinary Roman who would serve in the army and help gain this empire. And speaking across the ages, it spoke to young Winston Churchill. And in one of his few academic successes at school at Harrow, he recited the whole of Babington Macaulay's poem about Lars Porsena. Lars Porsena of Clusium, by the 9 gods he swore, that the great house of Tarquin should suffer wrong no more. By the 9 gods he swore it, and named a trysting day, and bade his messengers ride forth, east and west and south and north, to summon his array. In Babington's beautiful verses, it becomes like knights on their chargers riding out to do battle. East and west and south and north, the messengers ride fast, and tower and town and cottage have heard the trumpet's blast. Shame on the false Etruscan who lingers in his home when Porsena of Clusium is on the march for Rome. So too those English boys who fought against the American Revolution. They too were brave, and they would have said, shame on that Englishman who stays at home when the fairest part of our empire is about to break off. And so the Etruscans are warriors full worthy of the steel of the Romans. And so they march down upon Rome. Macaulay tells of the great camp of Porsena and how the Romans are driven back in the attack they make upon the army of Porsena. And thus they are driven all the way across the bridge. And Horatius and his 2 friends step up and say, we will protect it. And the Romans say, don't do it. I mean, why do you do it? Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods, and the tender mother who dandled him to rest, and for the wife who nurses his baby at her breast, and for the holy maidens who feed the eternal flame, to save them from false Sextus Tarquinius, that wrought the deed of shame. And Horatius holds the bridge. He swims across. The shouts of acclaim rise up, Macaulay tells us. A statue is erected to him, and he is given as much ground as he can plow in a single day. And his story lives on. And in the nights of winter, when the cold north winds blow, and the long howling of the wolves is heard amidst the snow, when round the lonely cottage roars loud the tempest din, and the good logs of Algus roar louder yet within, when the oldest cask is open and the largest lamp is lit, when the chestnuts glow in the embers and the kid turns on the spit, when young and old encircle around the firebrands close, when the girls are weaving baskets and the lads are shaping bows, when the good man mends his armor and trims his helmet's plume, preparing for the next war, when the good wives shuttle merrily goes flashing through the loom. With weeping and with laughter, still is the story told, how well Horatius kept the bridge in the brave days of old.